Thank you so much for that nice introduction, Brooke. Well, as she mentioned, I started my journey to this stage when I was on a journey to another kind of stage. I trained for 9 months for a bodybuilding show. And when I was visiting home, just ahead of the competition here in nearby Tacoma, a family member decided to tell me, completely unprompted, that I looked like a man. This is what I looked like at the time. After I got done rolling my eyes into the back of my head, it got me thinking about the standards that we have for women's bodies and what those standards are rooted in. Because although we feel like our ideas about bodies are hardwired, they're not. And I learned this firsthand. Because when I first started strength training, I didn't want to get any bigger. But as I got more into it, I realized I didn't care so much about that anymore. And in fact, I thought muscularity was pretty cool. I'm not the first person to change my mind. In ancient Egypt, it was all about having a slender body with narrow shoulders and a high waist, while ancient Greeks preferred a plumper physique with wide hips. In 1920s America, you wanted to be straight up and down, petite and flat-chested, while by the 1950s, it was an hourglass shape with soft shoulders and a narrow waist that was most coveted. You might think that these shifts changed slowly across time, but consider that in 2004, the most common Google searches in the US related to changing one's butt were how to make it smaller. Just a few years later, and untold YouTube videos and entire workout classes were devoted solely to expanding the gluteus maximus. So what made us want a small butt in the 2000s and a big one in the 2010s? Or think the voluptuous women of Rubens' paintings were the ideal in the 1600s, while Tiny Twiggy was all the rage 350 years later. I've spent a lot of time studying this, and there are 6 factors that I think play a role. Factor number 1, what's difficult is often desirable. Women have been asked to jump through hoops throughout history, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that the more challenging a particular body type is to attain, the more attractive we tend to find it. In times of famine, plumpness is sought after. In relative times of wealth, thinness rules. In a world where there are donuts everywhere, eating a maple bar, my personal favorite, is seen, maple bars, yes, seen as a lack of willpower. But in another era, hoarding those donuts might get you high marks. Factor number 2 is that social status is conveyed through bodies. We can learn something about people from the way that they look. For instance, if in ancient Greece you were fair-skinned, that meant that you weren't a slave, because slaves worked outdoors and developed tans. In Victorian times, it was a tight corset that created that narrow waist, and those were kind of hard to breathe in, which meant you weren't out working in a factory or otherwise engaged in manual labor. You were a lady of leisure, with the social graces and economic means that came with that status. Your body was the proof. Factor number 3 is that certain women just set the trends. In every era, for whatever reason, there are women who catch our eye, who have that je ne sais quoi that makes others want to emulate them. Love her or hate her, Kim Kardashian is in this category. She's not the first woman to have a small waist and a large derriere, not even the first highly visible celebrity to sport the look. Oh, hey there, J-Lo. But she popularized it in a way that no one previously had. She's just one example in a long line. Think about model Kate Moss in the 1990s with that heroin chic aesthetic, or designer Coco Chanel in the 1920s with the boyish look. These women captivated large swaths of the population, and where their bodies went, others tried to follow. Factor number 4 is that what we see becomes normal. When skinny jeans first hit the scene, I thought they were hideous. Everyone looked short and kind of squat, and I was like, where's a nice boot cut? But like the Jankos, the ultra-wide leg pants that were briefly hip in junior high, I thought this was a doomed trend. But it hung on. And the longer that it did, the better skinny jeans looked to me. I got a pair. Then I got another. Sadly ruined my favorite pair when I slipped on a wet leaf. And I still have them in the back of my closet as if they're gonna magically spring back to life, which I don't think is gonna happen at this point. But there is a point to my slightly sad story about clumsiness, and that is that this is known as the socio-cultural theory of body image. It says that the people we're around and the media we consume become our benchmark. Consider muscularity. If you don't hang out with a lot of women who are lifting heavy weights, then defined biceps and bulging quads will probably seem strange to you. Daniel Kunitz writes in his book Lift that he used to associate any woman who was bigger than a breadstick with slovenly corpulence until he started to CrossFit. And then he began to see muscles as something that stood for health and vitality, and therefore for beauty. Factor number 5 is that we've still got a few caveman instincts left over. We can't ignore biology completely. There are some body types that lend themselves better to bearing children than others, and that does matter. Author David Bainbridge writes in his book Curvology, clambering to the top of the social hierarchy was crucially important throughout human history, and we cannot now go back and erase that long heritage just because it makes us queasy. While our biology doesn't explain everything, it does add to our understanding of why one body can be seen as quote-unquote better than another. And the final factor at play is that current events matter, and they come into play. Think about World War II, when strong, capable women ruled because they had to keep everything humming at home while the men were away. Women like Katharine Hepburn, who was tall, angular, athletic, a little brash, represented the kind of gal who could get things done. Once the fellas returned, old-fashioned values came back in a big way. Men were men, and women were women, and the contrast between the two was important. Enter Marilyn Monroe, with her curvaceous, coquettish appearance that defined femininity at the time. Or consider that from the 1930s to the 50s, improvements in nutrition led to curvier shapes. Ads like this one from the Ironized Yeast Company were typical of the time. None wouldn't look at me when I was skinny, but since I gained 10 pounds this new, easy way, I have all the dates I want. What ideal is coming next? That is anyone's guess. But here's what I know for sure. Bodies aren't trends. No one sitting here today is always going to have a body that's in vogue. And when I rode strong like her, one of my goals was to show that strength doesn't look just one way. Unless you happen to be that magical unicorn who's tall but petite, with hips that are curvy and straight, skin that's tan and pale, and boobs that are big and small, you're never gonna always be in vogue. So instead, let's embrace our bodies for what they can do, whether that's standing for an 8-hour shift, or hoisting a child on our hip, or picking 300 pounds off the ground. Your body carries you through life, and that's what makes it beautiful. Even if some people might call it